discovering my love for the written word, for storytelling, for just the whole new worlds that opened to me through books, and many of which I discovered in libraries. So I'd like to give you some behind-the-scenes information about the book first, and then I'll share some insights and creative thoughts from many of the people I've interviewed. Now, my goal today is really to bring this book, The Creative Spark, to life, and to let you know what went into making the book, and how it's not just a celebration of these tremendously creative people, it's also a way that we can all get more in touch with the creativity within us. And the most gratifying feedback I've received about this book so far is when somebody comes up to me and says, I read your book and it made me realize that I want to be more creative in my life right now. I want to be more inspired, I want to be more artistic, I want to write more, or take photographs, or paint, or whatever one's creativity is, that if this book inspires that just a little bit, then I feel like I've done my job. And maybe job isn't even the right word now that I think of it. I think that my job has been, for the last 30 years as a journalist, to bring people out and have them tell their stories. I've also done some investigative work, but most of my work the last decade or so has been interviewing artists, musicians, writers. I've written book reviews for the Chronicle and many other publications. I've written concert previews. It's really interesting because when I started in journalism, say a musician, like for example, Sarah McLachlan just played this week in Santa Rosa. Typically, 30 years ago when I started as a journalist, I would have been sent to review her show and critique it and say this was good and this could have been better and so on. Now, mostly what we do is we preview shows. It's more of a reader service. We say, you know, maybe the Friday before, a story will run saying this Tuesday, Sarah McLachlan is playing at the Luther Burbank Center, or, you know, on Sunday, Lyle Lovett was at the Marin Center, and we interview the performer before. And so, in a way, we're presenting biographies or insights into these artists about their life, their art, their passions to our readers. And that has really been gratifying for me because I love profiling people. I love sharing what artists, musicians, writers are passionate about with an audience. And so I really appreciated this shift from previewing things to reviewing and critiquing things. So about the book, it's a collection of interviews with 32 people. There are 31 chapters, which you might wonder why. One chapter has 2 people in it, and that is the Lyle Lovett and Robert Olkeen chapter. These are Texas folk singers who have been friends since college, and they were performing together right here at the Marin Center 3 or 4 years ago. And instead of putting one story where Lyle says this and Robert Olkeen says that, I decided to let them talk about each other, because they're both very modest, humble guys. So I thought, let's ask Lyle about Robert Olkeen, and let's ask Robert about Lyle. And so that was that story. So that's one chapter. But I want to get back to the point that sometimes, especially in our society, which celebrates celebrity, we can overlook our own creative powers. And I really strongly believe that each one of us is full of creative energy. Sometimes we forget to cultivate it or encourage it to break out, but it's there, even if it's dormant. Every single one of us in this room is a source of creativity. So that's why I think the interviews with the people in this book can be so inspiring. Now I want to start with a little bit from the introduction, and you're looking at a picture of a swallowtail caterpillar right now, and you might be wondering, what does a swallowtail caterpillar have to do with creativity? So before I start talking about some nuggets of wisdom from some of the creative people such as Barbara Kingsolver, David Sedaris, Amy Tan, Francis Coppola, I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction. And before I start the introduction, I just wanted to add one more thing, which is that you look at some of these people like Amy Tan or Barbara Kingsolver or Smokey Robinson, and you're thinking of them instantly as superstars. But they all had a day when nobody knew who they were except their immediate friends and family. And Barbara Kingsolver in the book talks about she almost threw away her first novel, The Bean Trees, and she didn't believe in herself. And she literally was going out not sure if she was going to throw it into the trash or to a post office box. And she decided, she found the courage to send it to a publisher. It was published, and the rest is pretty much history. But Barbara Kingsolver wasn't always Barbara Kingsolver, the great author. Francis Coppola wasn't always Francis Coppola, the great director. And I'll talk about some of that later as well. Here's just a bit from the introduction. Something magical happened as I completed this book. One evening, just before sunset, I was in our backyard watering the planter boxes. On a stem of parsley, I noticed a startling pattern of color, concentric rings of orange and black dots. Looking closer, I saw the segments of a swallowtail caterpillar in it and could identify its tiny feet. For the next few days, the caterpillar chomped on the parsley plant, absorbing energy for the next stage of its life. I placed a stick in the pot at an angle to give the caterpillar a place to hang its chrysalis. The caterpillar's appearance felt like a message from the universe. For many months, I had been working on transforming interviews I had conducted with some of the world's most creative people into a coherent set of chapters. And I'd written biographical introductions that sought to put each person's life in perspective and offer insights about the sources of his or her art. As I write this, on 2019 summer solstice, our adopted caterpillar, my wife has given it the gender-neutral name Jordan, is undergoing a miraculous transformation into a butterfly. I talk a bit more about the caterpillar, and then I'll jump ahead to another bit from the introduction. Why bring up a caterpillar in a book about creativity? First, because it offers such a rich metaphor, suggesting that art depends on imagination. And to prepare for its transformation, the caterpillar needs to first feed itself, just as a musician or author must observe the thoughts and influences that come from songs, books, conversations, memories, and observations. Then many creative people seek to isolate themselves, cocoon-like, to escape the relentless drumbeat of popular culture so they can hear their own voices. And I think that's especially important in this day and age, in a time when we have so many distractions in our life. We have, Facebook, Instagram, Netflix, regular television. It's just so easy to be always diverted. And there's a quote from a musician named Kinky Friedman I'll read later that speaks to the issue of distraction. He's another Texan, but not everybody in the book is a Texan. The next person I quote, Pico Iyer. How many of you are familiar with the author Pico Iyer? This is a good group, maybe half. Pico is a fascinating writer. He has written a lot about travel. He also writes about stillness. He had a book called The Art of Stillness come out a few years ago, and he has a number of TED Talks about quieting down. So, what Pico told me was, quote, What I noticed at an early stage was that the writers I admire are living a long way from the world. The great originals are originals because they're living outside the received conversation. Outside secondhand words and secondhand ideas. To some extent, living in a space of their own, where they're able to hear their deeper self and come up with things completely outside the norm. I think that's why they really shake us. And just to jump ahead a bit of the introduction, of course, seeking solitude to hear one's inner voice doesn't mean we should shut out those who came before us. As the Iowa folk singer Greg Brown says, quote, I feel links back to a time that not much is known about. Songs, poetry, whatever you want to call it, that urge, it just goes way, way, way back there. And that's a good connection to feel to life. It's hard for me to imagine life without that. Now, Greg Brown is one of several people in this book that I'm betting the majority of the people who read the book or come to see me talk are not familiar with. Greg Brown is a gravelly baritone from Iowa, incredibly literate, we got into a conversation about James Joyce, and Greg's family has roots, one side of his family are Pentecostal preachers, and we were talking about Finnegan's Wake, and Greg said, oh, that's just James Joyce speaking in tongues. So it's really interesting. Some people think, oh, flyover estates, those guys don't read. Well, quite the opposite with many people there. But Greg is more of an under-the-radar guy, and I really made a conscious effort to include people like Greg Brown and the Irish writer Dervla Murphy, who I'll mention later, in the book, because we have some superstar celebrities here, but we also have a lot of voices in our society that are well worth hearing that maybe aren't on, you're not going to hear Greg Brown on the radio that much unless you listen to KPFA or some alternative station like that. So I really did want to include some people who were not mega celebrities. To conclude this part of the introduction, I write, which takes us back to butterflies. As author Barbara Kingsolver notes, monarch butterflies that travel from Appalachia down to Mexico may live for just a few weeks. During a migration, one generation dies and the next is born, several times. That means a butterfly returning from Mexico to Kentucky could be the great-great-grandchild of the one that departed months before. And yet it returns to the exact same spot from which its ancestors departed. Scientists don't fully understand this phenomenon, but perhaps the butterfly's internal compass is cellular. To consider this in human terms, the knowledge, dreams, hopes, and prayers of our ancestors reside within us. And so I really like that metaphor. I didn't know what the theme of the introduction was going to be until I saw that caterpillar hanging on the vine, that one, and chomping on our little parsley plant in the backyard. Now, throughout the course of this book, I've taken interviews I've already done with people like Graham Nash, with people like Lucinda Williams, another folk singer that maybe not everybody knows, but is wonderful. And I didn't have the space in either the book or the original story for a magazine or a newspaper to include everything. So what I do typically for the newspaper is include the most germane parts of the story to what that person is doing at the time. What I really loved about doing this book is that I could go deeper. Not just that I could include more about their lives, about what they told me, but that we had space for depth. I mean, in a newspaper story, I might get 750 words, but in a chapter on, say, Lucinda Williams, I might have 3,000 words. And so the format of the book, because I want you to hear each of these creative people in their own voice, is Q&A. But I wasn't just going to throw a bunch of Q&A down and call that a chapter. What I was going to do was introduce each person through a short biography at the beginning of the chapter. So each chapter starts with 3 or 4 pages of biography, maybe 1,000 words about the person's life, and then it goes into the Q&A. And it's an edited Q&A. For the book, I really focused on the parts that were germane to creativity. More the timeless aspects of the interview, not as much what the person was doing at that moment, although there is quite a bit of that as well. Here's one, as I was saying, you might not know everybody in the book. Oh, what happened? Do you see that too? Let's make that go away. Hello. I think we can handle this. Yeah. Great. Thanks. That's my tech support and my wife back there. Wait. I told her she's come to almost every talk I've given. I told her she didn't have to come today, that she could work, and she said, you might need tech support. And I was like, no, Dave and I got this, it's just a thumb drive, but she was right. Anyway, I've prepared, since this is a book about interviews, I've prepared a short interview with myself based on some of the questions that people have asked me about the book at these talks and elsewhere. So it's just 3 or 4 questions, and I think I'm actually quite prepared for it. So why did I choose the people in this book? Ultimately, these are people who inspire me, whether they're globally famous or under the radar, like Dave Alvin here. And And I really, there were interviews with other people. I have, this is really the best of my last dozen years or so, 12 years of interviews. But there were so many others. I mean, if I had 600 pages, I could have put another 20 interviews into the book. Nobody wants to read a 600-page book. So we kept it tight to really the best of the best. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's no objective measuring stick for what is the best. These are the people who I felt were most inspiring to me, and hopefully they will be inspiring to you as well. Is there a common theme in the book, of those profiled in the book? I'd say each person is distinct and has charted her or his own course, but I would say they all value originality, and they're pioneering and insatiably curious. Every one of these people in this book has continued to be creative, even into their later years. I had the chance to interview Joan Rivers. She was working incessantly, pretty much until the day she passed away. And other people have said, would you say these people are a roadmap for how all of us can be creative? And I would say the word roadmap made me hesitate, because I would never say, do exactly what Merle Haggard did, do exactly what Joan Rivers did. Each life is an individual endeavor. Do what, create your own path, follow your own muse, do what makes you happy or fulfilled or excited or passionate. And so I think I love when somebody says these interviews inspire me to be more creative, but I wouldn't say that anybody's path is really a roadmap for anybody else. Merle Haggard here, I just had to talk about Merle. He is not a man of many words. He was not a man of many words. He's an incredibly talented songwriter. It's funny because one of his most popular songs was called Okie from Muskogee, but he's a Californian. I mean, his family came from Oklahoma when he was very young, but he grew up around Bakersfield, and he really is one of the quintessential California songwriters. But not the easiest interview. I interviewed him in 2010. He had just come out with an album called I Am What I Am. And so I like to get people talking about what's new in their life, what they just did. So early in the interview I said, Merle, could you please tell me about your new album, I Am What I Am? And he just paused and hesitated and thought and cleared his throat, and he just said, it is what it is. So, there's not a lot of places you can go from there. I mean, I always prepare questions. People sometimes ask me how I prepare. If it's a musician, I immerse myself in their music. I read interviews with them. The web is an incredible resource, so I can read 20 interviews with Merle Haggard conducted by newspapers or magazines or on YouTube or whatever. Although he really didn't love to do a lot of interviews. There is an interesting New Yorker profile of him from when he was in middle age. Back to the common themes from some of these people. A lot of them talked about ignoring the rules, having the courage to say what you think, and also not chasing commercial success. I think people who really are genuinely creative, they want as many people as possible to hear the music or read their books or see their paintings or read their poetry, but the act of chasing commercial success almost inevitably undermines the creative process. So back to Dave Alvin for a moment. Dave Alvin had a great line. He's a folk rock singer, tremendous songwriter, and he had a line saying, there's just no reason to go downtown in the music industry because that's where Britney Spears lives. There's just no reason to play the game. I just can't play it and win. So it's not just that he's choosing he's not just intentionally avoiding commercial success. He's acutely aware that if he tried to be a pop star, he wouldn't make it. So he does what he does, which is deeply rooted California songwriting. Sometimes he was in a band called the Blasters, and that was more of a rockabilly outfit. But he's true to himself, essentially. Now I'm going to read some of the best quotes from the book, what people have told me about creativity, about truth, about art, and many other topics. So here's the wonderful author. I bet, unlike a couple of other people I mentioned, I bet pretty much everybody in this room knows the author Amy Tan and her book, The Joy Love Club, which became a movie. And I just want to say I'm really happy to see some younger people here because I didn't know what the audience would be like. Some of these people have been around and tend to skew towards a more experienced demographic, but it's great, and so thank you. Anybody who's younger than me, thank you for coming. Here's Amy Tan on truth. I realized that if I described what I felt, the complexity of it, the history of it, in a fabricated story, paradoxically, I would find truth through creating fiction. Every single moment I've had is not a lost past. It's a complete continuum of who I am. All these moments are who I am. Writing fiction is finding the meaning of my life, what I think, what I feel I have to remember, what I know about myself. So isn't that interesting? Fiction, people think it means not true. Fiction actually is based in the Latin word fictia, which means to give shape to. And I think that's what a novelist does. She gives shape to a story. She decides what to include, what to leave out, and how to put it together. Back to good old Greg Brown. His work is very poetic. He even has an album from 1994 called The Poet Game. And I'll read you a bit about what he says about poetry. Poems, good poems, are music really. And when you hear a good poet reading, they're really singing their poems. Poetry without the musical element to me, it's not poetry, it's something else. Poetry is not a position paper or anything, it's a song. So people like Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, William Carlos Williams, Walt Whitman, these have all been very important singers to me. Interesting, right? The overlap between music and poetry, but here's Lucinda Williams. I'm just always curious, how many people know Lucinda Williams? Maybe about half, a little more than half. Wonderful musician, hard to, Americana is usually the label affixed to her, hard to pinpoint her. She sings ballads, she sings from the heart. That's why people love her so much. And she, Lucinda, is the daughter of the poet Miller Williams, a Southern poet, and here's what she had to say about free expression. My dad used to always say, never censor yourself. I'm fortunate in that regard. I was very blessed because my father was a poet and a sort of mentor to me. I've always been somewhat of a rebel. It's kind of in my blood. I like to push people's buttons a little bit. I want people to be moved. And Lucinda and I still talked about poetry and music because as the daughter of a poet, I was curious. And she said, actually she views them as distinct forms, very different. But she said poetry and songwriting have one thing that's deeply in common, and that is you make every word count. Whether you're writing a song or writing a poem, and you don't have that many words to work with, so you have to make every single word count. Okay, David Sedaris. I know that Dave said David Sedaris is a favorite. I imagine he's a favorite of many people here. You maybe read his work, you maybe heard him on National Public Radio. He's often on the radio program This American Life. And I think there's so much I appreciate about David's writing, but one thing I especially appreciate is he helps people remember things from their past because he's such a keen observer. So he was telling me about a story he wrote for The New Yorker in 2013 called Company Man. And there's a scene that takes place in a station wagon in that story. And here's what he writes. My sisters and I are in what we call the way back of the station wagon. Reading the story in a theater to an audience, I hear way back, from people who haven't heard the term way back in years. People who are my age, whose family had a station wagon, and they used to ride in the way back of the station wagon. Sometimes you can hear the audience murmuring because you've touched something that they've forgotten about. And I think that's such a gift when a writer can do that, when a writer can say, hey, remember this? If you're maybe of a certain age, over 55 or 60, your family had a station wagon when you were a kid, and You know, like I'm just old enough to remember my brother and I were in the back of the station wagon. We put the back seat down, and then we'd have this area the size of a bed, but slip because it was hard, and we'd slam into each other as we rounded turns, and so it just brings back memories. And I mean, the David Sedaris chapter is called "Say Anything," and those of you familiar with his work will know that he does say anything, which is another thing I appreciate about him. Now, earlier I mentioned the Texas singer-songwriter Kinky Friedman. He got the nickname Kinky because he had ringlets in his hair. His hair was kinky as a kid. And his quotation is a bit off the wall, but I think it's really important. We were speaking about distraction, and he said he's a friend of Willie Nelson. He said he and Willie were on the phone one night, and Willie said, "Kinky, you gotta turn off Matlock." Now you guys might not know who Matlock was. Matlock was a TV show maybe in the 70s. Basically, Matlock is a code word for distraction. So here's what Kinky had to say about that. "We all have a Matlock in our lives, something you're doing that keeps you from what you could accomplish. And the minute I turned Matlock off, really turned him off, it opened up a lot of things. A guy who sits down and says, 'I'm going to write a great song,' or 'I'm going to paint my masterpiece,' he never does. It's always done obliquely. It's done by a guy who was trying to pay the rent like Van Gogh, starving to death someplace, and disowned by his family, living with a prostitute and a little kid, and winding up in a sanitarium with nothing but a stray cat as his friend." So, very creative guy. He kind of segued from turning off distraction to intention. And I would say the people I profile in this book don't have any firm agreement on intention. Some will say intention and hard work and nose to the grindstone is extremely important. Kinky, for him as a songwriter, he approaches it more obliquely, as he said. Now, Melvin Seals, another artist that maybe not everybody knows, a musician, local San Francisco musician. He grew up in the church. I'm featuring some local people here today since we're in the San Francisco area. Melvin, played organ in his church for many years, and then started playing a little bit of rock and roll in the secular world. And he was asked by a friend to audition for the Jerry Garcia band because they needed a new keyboardist. And Melvin was pretty much, "Yeah, I think I've heard of Jerry Garcia. Who does he play for?" So Melvin at the time didn't know anything really about the Grateful Dead. This was Jerry's side project. It was not playing keyboard for the Grateful Dead. It was for the Jerry Garcia band, which was Jerry's side project. And Melvin walked into the rehearsal space, which was right near here in San Rafael, Front Street in San Rafael. And the 6 members of the band were there, or the 5, and he met Jerry and John Kahn, and they're all shaking hands, and then they played 3 songs, Melvin told me, and then Melvin turned to Jerry and he said, "Hey man, you're a pretty good guitarist." And everybody was just cracking up. He didn't really get the joke at the time. He's like, "What's so funny?" But, so there are a lot of stories like that in this book. And obviously he did get the gig. He became the keyboardist for Jerry Garcia band for the last 15 years of Jerry's life, which was 1980 to 95, and now has carried on the tradition of Grateful Dead music with his own band. So another local, I bet a number of baseball fans in this room know who Mike Kruko is. So it's not just the typically creative people you think about in music or the arts or writing. I had the opportunity to interview Mike Kruko for the Alaska Airlines magazine, and they feature, San Francisco is one of their main hubs. So they interview people who they think would be of interest to their audience. And Mike was amazing. He gave me a half hour of his time. Some of you may know that Mike has some physical challenges. And so it took like 2 minutes just to from the broadcast booth to the next booth at the Giants ballpark, which was Willie McCovey's old booth. And we did the interview there as batting practice took place. And some of you know Kruko for his creative expressions, but what I really liked about what Kruko said was that he prepares diligently for each broadcast, and he'll have all these little stories and facts and figures, And he said, you know, I'm not the only one who does that. A lot of the young broadcasters are really good about doing their homework. But here's what they don't always realize. That just because you've done your homework and found out some interesting tidbits doesn't mean you need to force feed it into the broadcast. He waits until something is germane or relevant, and he says, oh, by the way, like he's just having a nice conversation with his broadcast partner, Dwayne Kuiper. Did you know that 15 years ago so-and-so did something? So he has it at his fingertips, but he's not going to use it unless the situation calls for it. And I really, I appreciate that about Kruko. Frances Mays. Frances Mays, wonderful writer. She was a poet before she was before she wrote all her Tuscany books, and later became a novelist as well. Frances Mays, I would say, reinvented her life, which is an act of creation. She moved to Italy. She and her husband Ed bought this house in Tuscany, and that was a creative act, to take this rundown, crumbling house in the Tuscan hills and rebuild it, basically, remodel it. When I was there, I interviewed her at the home in Italy some years ago. She showed me frescoes that they had uncovered during the remodeling process, and then she took the next step in creation, which, okay, so she did this creative project, and then she distilled it into her book about Tuscany, Under the Tuscan Sun. Her latest work is called Women in Sunlight, and it's about several women who are headed for an assisted living facility, and they say, screw it, we're going to go to Italy and live there. And so it's a fun topic, and that just came out maybe 2 years ago. That's Frances. Ian Anderson, the frontman of Jethro Tull. I imagine many of you know Jethro Tull. Is anybody unfamiliar with the band Jethro Tull? It's fine if you are. Okay. Jethro Tull is a band that came up in the late 60s when a lot of other bands burst onto the scene in London and Britain. He's been around for 50-some years, and he talks about how he took up the flute, because the flute was not really a rock and roll instrument at that time. So here's Ian Anderson. We were always thinking about a point of difference. You've got to have something that sets you apart from everybody else if you're going to sell fish or breakfast cereal or even music. Without having studied marketing or commerce as a youngster, I inherently knew that there was not much point in being another, probably very second-rate guitar player in the face of such overwhelming competition from Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck and Jimi Hendrix and Jimmy Page. I looked around for something different to do, and the flute just happened to catch my eye in a shop window. I thought, well, I'll give it a go. It's not like a cello or a tuba to have to carry around. It more or less slips into my pocket, so I decided to get a flute. Now, he might be oversimplifying it a little bit, but really interesting how he consciously thought, I want a creative life, and I'm not going to measure up to Clapton or Hendrix or Jimmy Page. So what can I do? How can we be different? And I think Jethro Tull was very different, not just because of the flute, but because Jethro Tull incorporated a lot of classical influences into rock, which was something adopted later by some other bands. I'm thinking of Yes or Genesis, the whole progressive rock movement of the 70s. But Ian Anderson really was a pioneer with Jethro Tull. So we're coming to the home stretch here. I like this writer, Dervla Murphy. She's a very intrepid travel writer. When she was around 30, she had to care for her mother since she was in her late teens, and so she couldn't travel much for her early adulthood. And her mother passed when she was about 30. It was the dead of winter. She got on her bike and started going. Seriously, she left Ireland, she took a ferry across, rode across Europe, rode across Iran, Afghanistan. She was chased by wolves, literally. She was chased by men with guns. She was chased by men who might have been rapists. And she outrode them all. And really, I mean, I gotta say, even more, if you'll excuse me, even more badass is in the 60s, she wanted a daughter but not a husband. She wanted a child but not a husband. So she arranged to get pregnant, and in Catholic Ireland, southern rural Ireland, in the 1960s, she had a daughter. Anyway, quick comment about solitude, which can be really important in the creative process from Dirk or Murphy. I come back with lots and lots of notes, far more than I can ever use. Then I lock the gates and settle down to work. She literally lives in a house with gates. It used to be the old market for this little town in Southern Ireland called Lismore. So she has these big wrought iron gates, and she can lock them, and she does. Some people think I'm just being neurotic because most writers can lead normal social lives. They don't have to lock themselves away. But I find that distractions, say going out for an evening with friends, just breaks my concentration. It's not just a question of going out for an evening. It would take me 2 or 3 days to get back to where I was before I went out. So she's very conscious about when she's working, the work comes first. And I think if you are creative, it's not just about moments of inspiration, it really is about the work. Richard Thompson, another wonderful songwriter from Britain, he started out in a band called Fairport Convention, then went out with his wife. Richard and Linda Thompson did an album together called Shoot Out the Lights, which is recorded as they're divorcing, so talk about passion. And they were contractually obligated to tour, so they toured as they were separating, which Rolling Stones said was one of the all-time great tours in rock and roll. Anyway, Richard Thompson on storytelling in a song. You have 3 verses to tell a story. Traditional ballads can be longer, but in a modern song, you can use more of a cinematic technique to tell a story. You can jump into the middle of the action and use first-person narrative to have a point of view, and then go to the middle of the story. So what he's talking about is you can fracture the timeline. You don't have to start at the beginning and then talk about the middle and the end. And the other thing, not in this quote, but the other thing that he spoke about was that the music itself can tell part of the story. You have so few words, but in a song it's not just about the words. It's also about how the music tells the story. So, now Phil Cousineau, there's a lot I could talk about in the Phil Cousineau chapter, but I wasn't sure about the composition of the audience today, so I wanted to highlight something he said at a commencement address at the Marin School, just down the street. And I think it's really germane to any age. And this is what Phil said. He's a San Francisco author. He's not as well known either as some of the other people in the book, but he's a documentarian. He has a show on PBS called Global Spirit that maybe some of you have seen, where he interviews some of the most spiritual and intellectual minds of our time. So last year he did this commencement address at the Marin School, and he told the students, find what you're passionate about. Don't worry about money or society's approval. And I think that latter part's really important because you've probably heard don't worry about money before, but I think a lot of people do worry about parental approval, society approval, and you just have to release that to find your own creative path. Continuing, Phil says, find something creative to do. Be passionate, be engaged, politically engaged. You can be creative, artistic, write short stories and poems, but the other half of life is being what the French call engagé, engaged. I told the class, find a way to be engaged with the world. Do something. Be part of the response to the day. And I think in these times, that's especially important. Be part of the response to the day. Judy Collins, who's 80 years old. I know, aren't these pictures remarkable? Most of them were provided by the artists themselves. I have a few of my own photos in the book, but that's clearly a studio photograph. And look how beautiful she is. You know, she just turned 80 last year. She's still touring, still singing. She worked with Leonard Cohen in the 60s, sang some of his songs, like Suzanne, Dress Rehearsal Rag, Stranger Song. And of course, she is the sweet Judy Blue Eyes. She was Stephen Still's lover in the 60s. And so if you've ever heard the song Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, that's, of course, Judy Collins. I asked her about how she takes care of herself, and in particular, how does she take care of her voice? I just watch it. I'm careful. I eat right. I sleep a lot. I don't scream or yell. I don't smoke, don't drink. I don't do drugs. I live like an athlete. I exercise. You have to. very concise sentences. I mean, I guess she didn't want to use too much of her voice in our interview. But we did have a nice conversation, and she was extremely warm and gracious, like almost every single person in this book. In fact, I would say every single person in this book was uncommonly kind, forthcoming, willing to share their deeper thoughts, talk to me about their lives. Not every single interview is like that, but the musician who started our interview with the yawn, she didn't make it into this book. And, I don't need to say who she is, but and even she warmed up once we got to have, people really respond, and some people ask me how I prepare for the interviews. So I actually have a set of 3x5 cards in front of me, handwritten, and I order them, but sometimes I reorder them as the conversation goes along, throwing some out, jotting down ideas for new questions, sparked by something the subject might say. So there's a lot going on, but if the subject can tell you're prepared, if they can tell that you've prepared for the interview, they're much more willing to really talk to you and really open up to you. So I think that's a key. Just a couple more. The great director Francis Ford Coppola, who some of you may know wrote the script for the movie Patton, about General George C. Patton. It was initially rejected, and it was only after the first director of that movie didn't work out, a second director came in and heard there had been a previous script. He said, let me see that script. So that's how Coppola's script for Patton, of course you know him from Apocalypse Now, I mean, gosh, he's in all the Godfather movies, he's legendary. But here's what he talks about having conviction early in your career. Very often films or scripts start rubbing the audience the wrong way if they're doing something a little different than what is the norm. So films like Apocalypse Now were not exactly heralded as, oh wow, that's terrific at the time. But those films stood the test of time, and over the years, little by little, sort of changed what movies were like. I always say that the things you do when you're young that get you fired are the same things that get you Lifetime Achievement Awards later. So he really believed in this, and it's a very hard thing. He had a family to support. He self-financed a couple of his pictures, risking his home, risking his office, risking his savings. So I have a lot of respect for people who, I mean, Apocalypse Now, self-funded. If that hadn't done well, and then he self-funded another film that didn't do as well, and he almost lost his home. So we saw Pico earlier. I'm gonna jump ahead to Robert L. Keane and Lyle Lovett, who I mentioned. And I really like, Robert L. Keane is probably not quite as well known as Lyle Lovett, maybe because he didn't marry Julia Roberts. But I really like what he said about fiction. Now here's a musician, remember, talking about fiction, and you'll see in the book, if you get a copy, that so many of these genres overlap. You'll have musicians talking about fiction, you'll have writers talking about poetry and about music, and anyway, Robert L. Keane on fiction. I heard someone explain, it may have been John Updike, that he likes fiction because in fiction, people are basically telling the truth disguised as a story, and in nonfiction, people are trying to make a story out of something that might not be story-worthy. So they have to lie a little bit. I love fiction because you're able to create these characters that can really tell the truth. So, again, truth doesn't depend on facts necessarily, especially if you're writing a short story or a song. And I think that's what this quote gets at. Lyle Lovett on songwriting. You think about everything that you've ever learned when you're trying to write a song. You try to trick yourself into writing something good any way you can. You start with a lead and see what happens. Songs are slippery. Writing songs is the hardest part of everything. A song is a place where you can get away with telling the truth in an unvarnished way. So again, it's song as a vehicle for truth. And I like what he says about, he doesn't really know where he's going when he starts. He's just like, this is my starting point, and I'm gonna go from here and see where it leads. So it's an exploration, really, in a way. I mentioned Joan Rivers earlier, and many of you know her as quite a caustic comedian, but what a heart of gold she had. We got to meet her and spend a few minutes with her when she performed in Napa, and she always wanted to be a Broadway stage actress. She had a couple of shots at it, she had mediocre reviews, she then had a great successful career as a comedian, and then later in life, 2008, 2009, that time period, she premiered a solo show in the UK, the Fringe Festival in Scotland, and there was a reviewer from London who gave it, didn't quite pan it, but gave it at best a mediocre review. And then she said, she told me she was done. She's like, that was it. She was really sensitive, and that might surprise some of you. I think that's one thing I really liked about doing this book, is it made me remember things about people like, here's this person who could be, some might even say, mean-spirited on stage, always really funny, and I think more than anything, honest. So I spoke to her about honesty because, well, I'll just read the quote. I think if you bring something out in the public awareness, it's not terrible if you're all talking about it. And that's exactly why I talk about my late husband, Edgar's suicide. If we talk about it, we can solve anything. Just put it on the table and tell the truth. So imagine how painful. I mean, here's a woman who lost her beloved husband. He was mentally ill and committed suicide in the late 80s, I believe. And she's gone on and been a spokesperson for mental health and getting treatment and asking for help. Just a couple more I want to mention briefly. Studs Terkel, the great oral historian, he wrote a book in the 70s called Working, in which he interviewed not just celebrities, but people, everyday people, the waitress, the gas meter reader, people who had hard jobs, and got them to talk about their lives. And he told me a story once about interviewing a waitress, as they called them at the time, now we would say a server, but he interviewed a waitress in front of her little kids, and then he played back the recording, and this waitress started crying. She said, I never heard myself. I never knew what I thought before. And so I think it's these moments. I think that's what oral history can do, and Studs was the best. He had a radio show in Chicago. Chicago's called the city of broad shoulders, and Studs metaphorically certainly had those broad shoulders and propelled a lot of careers. And so I'm going to read one from Studs and then one from Smokey Robinson, and we'll take questions. Studs Terkel on potential. An American poet from an Italian family said his uncle used to hear Caruso all the time. As a small boy, he said there was something about him, as a small boy, he said there was something about him that was about the possibilities in the human race. Caruso would hit a certain note, that's as far as you could go, and then he would just go beyond that. And it told me that human beings have possibilities, that there is within us certain potentialities not yet tapped. Now, Studs died at the age of 96 in 2008, just 3 days before Election Day. I think he died on Halloween. And I wanted to close with Smokey Robinson, because Smokey's whole song catalog, and not just his songs, he wrote tons of songs for other bands like The Temptations and Marvin Gaye, and also he was an executive, he was a vice president at Motown before his 21st birthday. So really an accomplished figure. But Smokey doesn't write about issues of the day as much. He doesn't write about politics. He writes about love. And I asked him why. And he said, love is everlasting. I want to write everlasting songs. I want to write songs that if I had written 50 years before or 50 years from now, they will mean something. Love will be around forever. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming. I'll sign books later, but let's thank you. Very much. Let's start right here. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question about something, and I don't recall the creative person you cited, but you spoke about how going after commercial success was not the right way to go. I'm paraphrasing here, you can correct me if I say
Sure, no,
that
you're
wrong.
right, yeah.
My
That's
question
right.
is this, have you ever interviewed people like, I'm thinking of, well, really obvious example, well, somebody like Jeff Koons, who is regarded as, somewhat exploitive in how they manage their career, but someone who you might not expect to have a story to tell because of their apparent commercialism, but actually there's something else going on you didn't know about.
Yeah, did people hear the question in the back, or should I repeat?
Repeat.
So the question was about people who have intentionally sought commercial success and even done so in an exploitive way. You mentioned the artist Jeff Koons. Well, first of all, most people that I interviewed, they were not. I didn't interview as many visual artists because it's just not what I cover as much. But I don't think there's anything inherently wrong. I think some people have achieved commercial success in ways that might be not looked on with great affection. But I haven't personally found that in the people I've interviewed. Some of them have had tremendous commercial success, like Smokey, but they've always been, as far as I can see, doing it in a way that is uplifting and not in a way that has exploited other people. I'm sure some people have, and I might not know about it, but that didn't really get into the interviews so much. Interesting question, though. Yes?
Are you familiar with the work of Nardwar? He's a musician interviewer. He's been doing it since the 90s.
What's his name?
Nardwar?
Nardwar? No, I don't know his work.
Do you think that interviewing younger musicians is important to kind of get a grasp on the current, I guess the current...
Absolutely, yeah. It just so happens that the publications I work for tend to interview people who are older, like, newspapers basically are read more by older people. I mean, I have interviewed some people who are somewhat younger, like the rapper Common. I would have loved to have put that in the book. He only had 15 minutes, so I didn't really have enough for a chapter in the book, but Common was great to talk to. But if you look at when people really make their mark, whether in music or writing, a lot of times people's most creative time in life is when they're younger. People keep touring and they keep creating, and I really like somebody like Graham Nash, who's in his 70s, is still creating new music. But if you look at their creative peak, I would say a lot of people hit their creative peak in their 20s, early 30s, even late teens sometimes. I wish I were more familiar with some of the younger, I gotta be honest, I couldn't tell you who half the people who won Grammys this year were, but I'd like to be more in touch. I think, yes, it's really important to be more in touch with younger artists. Yes, in the back.
Yeah.
Two in the back, yeah.
So it seems like your interviews have primarily been with people in the arts.
Correct.
My question is, if you were to think about creativity apart from the arts, in other facets of human endeavor,
Sure.
who are some of the people you might want to interview, and what might you ask?
Okay, did everybody hear the question, or should I repeat? Okay, it sounds like it. So, as you were asking that question, I thought of one person who is in the book who you might never consider having a creative career, and that is Warren Hellman. Warren Hellman was a financier. He, 25 years ago, was president of Lehman Brothers. His great-grandfather was a co-founder of Wells Fargo Bank. And he was a banker who loved to play the banjo. And he was also a banker who made a lot of money. And his philosophy was that money is like manure. If you pile it all in one place, it really stinks. But if you spread it out, you can make beautiful things grow. So he founded a festival. He founded the Hardly Strictly Bluegrass Festival, which some of you may have attended. It's that huge free festival in Golden Gate Park, the first weekend of October every year. And he started it as a bluegrass festival with people like Emmylou Harris and Hazel Dickens and just some real down-to-earth bluegrass people. And then after a couple years, they changed it from strictly bluegrass to hardly strictly bluegrass. And now it's open to everybody, people like Gillian Welch, and you name it. Greg Brown has played there, who I mentioned. Dave Alvin has played there. They have blues, they have funk, they have soul, they have everything at that festival now. And it's free, which is really a gift to the city. So he's somebody. In terms of the rest of your question, God, there's so many creative people. I wish I could, I hope there's a sequel because I'd love to.
That'd be good.
I'd love to do more. And I mean, there were people I interviewed, like another local person, Dana Carvey. What a creative guy he is. Unfortunately, our conversation it was during late in the George W. Bush administration, so it was some time ago. And so it wasn't really timely, and it was also, it just wasn't enough about the I mean, he was really funny, but it wasn't enough about creativity to put in the book. So, so I really stuck with the people who spoke about creativity. I know there was another, yes, in the gold.
So you interviewed a whole bunch of people and you picked the most inspiring ones. How did you
Right.
get access to all these people to start with? And second, what is the one thing that really jumped out of you that might have changed and inspired your life out of everybody? Who was the one, or is there a quote or a person that was like, whoa, that changed my life?
Yeah, okay, so the first part first. Typically the process is I get assigned by a newspaper or magazine to write about somebody. So say, for example, Smokey Robinson was coming to play in Santa Rosa, the Press Democrat up in Sonoma County wanted a story. So they assign me the story, then I approach Smokey's people, I say, there's this concert coming up in 4 weeks, we'd love to interview Smokey, can you provide any time? Not always will they grant it. If the show is sold out, they have less incentive to do the interview, but somebody like Smokey was amazing. They only gave me 15 minutes. They said, would you be willing to talk to Smokey at 7:15 on a Friday morning? I'm like, I'd be willing to talk to Smokey at 4:15 on a Friday morning. Whenever Smokey wants to talk, I will be available. So they like that. And then, and I just have to share one anecdote from that at the end. I'm going to turn the question around a little bit. I asked Smokey what he was most proud of, and he said, you know what, Michael, this moment right now that a young guy like you wants to talk to me after 50 years in the business. So anyway, he's really good. He's really sweet. He made me feel great. The first thing that came to mind when you asked your question about what inspired me, there was something Phil Cousineau said about being creative every single day. He's like, create something, even if you just write a postcard, even if you just take a photograph that's creative. It's like, do something creative every day and recognize that creativity is work. And you need, you can get that creative spark, but you need the bellows to take that spark from just the spark. I mean, we all have creative sparks that come at us, but cultivate them, nurture them, turn those creative sparks into fires. And so that really made an impact. We have time for a few more yet. Let's get somebody who hasn't asked a question yet. Unless, okay, then you
It's
go.
a fun one.
Yes, okay.
So your bio says that you wrote a column in the Chronicle about gambling.
I did write a column about gambling.
If you tie that in with the rest of your story, I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I'm a freelance journalist, so I'll do almost anything for money. So what happened with that, I had been a regular freelance contributor to the Chronicle since the 1990s. Well, it was the Examiner in the 90s and after the merger. The merger was, I think, 2000 or 2001. After the merger, I started writing more for the Chronicle. From 2000 to 2004, I had a regular travel column in the Chronicle, focusing on internet travel technology. And then, I don't know, my wife counted once. I think I've written for 10 different sections of the Chronicle, something like that. 9 or 10. But so I had a good friend who wrote a short column on gambling for the entertainment section, which is called The Date Book, and he was just burnt. He didn't want to do it anymore. And so it was a column about gambling in Northern California, which ranged from everything from a new casino opening up to, like, when the Warriors or Giants win the playoffs, their odds, what the bookmakers were saying about their chances, to strategy for, blackjack or something. And so it was, for a while, I did it 50 weeks a year, and then the person who asked me to cover it for him, I said, why don't we do it together? So that was really fun. So then I got to write it every other week. But I'm really fascinated by gambling. I think I mean, I don't like that some people have a problem with it, because it's an addiction like anything else, but I find it very entertaining and fun. Yes, in the back.
So there's a lot of speculation about a connection between creativity and mental illness. Are you familiar with that?
I had a similar question yesterday. I did an event in Petaluma,
So I'm
and
curious about, how much evidence you saw of that in the interviews you've conducted and reading about. Do people share stories about depression, loneliness,
absolutely,
suffering?
yeah. I mean, I'll repeat the question just in case everybody here. So the question was about the overlap between creativity and some aspects of mental illness, and yes, a lot of people, either themselves or in their family that I interviewed, have had brushes with mental illness. Some have had issues with alcohol or substance abuse. Others have had, for example, Judy Collins had a son who was an addict and ended up overdosing and dying. And interestingly, it was Joan Rivers who said, so this happened shortly after Joan lost her husband, and let me get the story right. Was it Joan to Judy or Judy to Joan? I'd have to go back to the chapter, but basically one said the other, you have to get back to work. You have to get back to work after a tragedy in the family. I think several of the people I interviewed were somewhat on the spectrum, either perhaps slightly autistic or maybe a touch of Asperger's. I don't know, and I'm not going to say who. I'm certainly not going to diagnose anybody, but I do think some people who battle with some of these demons are some of the most creative people in our society. Absolutely. Yeah, interesting question. Maybe one more, and then we'll sign some books. Or if that's it, we can. Oh, good. Yes, right. One more.
I was just thinking when you responded to a question in the back about the non-artists among us, the ones of us that don't sing or write. Are the left brain people likely to be creative but in a different way, or are you born with a right brain gene and you're going to go in that direction, but creativity is less available to the left brain as brain people?
Did everybody hear that? Yeah, so really interesting question. I think, again, I'm not a scientist, I think some of us are more left brain focused, more creative naturally. Some of us are more right brain, where we're task oriented, for example. But we both have both halves. And I think our society really emphasizes, the right brain is the creative side. I don't know if I just mixed that up. Our society is really, from, I think, our earliest years, sending a message that we should be practical, we should be diligent, we should get stuff done, we should drink coffee should be our drug, and be productive. So I think a lot of people might have some suppressed creativity, and I think there's all sorts of ways to bring it out. I think, reading this book is my hope anyway, is that it will inspire people to be more creative and awaken that creativity, whatever brain side they use more. Okay, I'll take one from this young man over here, and then we'll wrap up and sign.
So I'm a freshman here,
Yeah.
and I've declared my majors as, I'm doing 2 majors, one in fine arts and one in business administration.
Great.
So I'm really hoping that what you said is right about being able to work both sides of the brain.
Well, it sounds like you're on the right path. You're pursuing your and we all got to eat too. So a lot of these people talk about doing things in their life to make a living, but that doesn't mean they compromise on their creativity. Maybe people are just creative as an avocation, not necessarily vocation. So I think we all have enough time of the day, if we turn off Matlock, if we turn off Facebook, to have some creative time. Thank you very much.